DHL cargo crash. On November 25, 2024, a DHL cargo plane was flying from Leipzig, Germany to Vilnius, Lithuania. The aircraft was an older Boeing 737-400, about 31 years old, and operated by a Spanish company called Swift Air. There were 4 crew members on board from Spain, Germany, and Lithuania, and the plane was carrying a standard shipment of packages. Everything seemed normal until the plane began its final approach to Vilnius International Airport. It was early in the morning, the skies were cloudy, and the weather was cold with freezing temperatures. As the aircraft descended, something went wrong. Instead of landing on the runway, the plane crashed roughly 4/5 of a mile short, just outside the airport perimeter. The jet slammed into a residential neighborhood called Leipkalnis. It crashed into the yard of a 2-story house, broke apart on impact, and burst into flames. Tragically, one of the pilots, a Spanish national, died in the crash. The other 3 crew members survived, though they were injured. Miraculously, all 13 people who lived in the house made it out safely before the fire spread. Investigators moved quickly to figure out what caused the crash. Early findings showed there was no foul play, no terrorism, no sabotage. Instead, human error seemed to be the likely cause. Experts pointed to a possible breakdown in communication with air traffic control and maybe even fatigue from the flight crew as contributing factors. Both the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder were recovered for analysis. But what if the pilots never make a mistake, and the instruments themselves betray the crew? That's exactly what happened just a few years earlier in Amsterdam. Turkish Airlines Flight 1951. Turkish Airlines Flight 1591 was a regular international flight, taking passengers from Istanbul, Turkey to Amsterdam in the Netherlands. It was February 25, 2009. The plane, a Boeing 737-800 named Tekerdag, was carrying 128 passengers and 7 crew members. Most of the people on board were traveling for business or tourism, and it was supposed to be just a normal, short European flight. Everything was going smoothly until they got close to Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport. As the plane approached runway 18R, a long runway known as the Polderbaan, it lined up for landing using the Instrument Landing System, or ILS. But what the pilots didn't realize was that something had gone wrong. The airplane's left radio altimeter, a device that tells the plane how high it is off the ground, started giving a false reading. Even though the plane was still about 2,000 feet in the air, the altimeter suddenly told the plane's computer that it was at 0 feet, basically already on the ground. Because of that bad signal, the plane's auto-throttle system automatically pulled the engines back to idle, like it would normally do when landing. But they were nowhere near the runway yet. The engines stayed at idle, and the plane's speed started dropping fast. The pilots didn't catch the problem right away. By the time they noticed the plane was losing too much speed and started pushing the throttles back up, it was too late. The Boeing 737 stalled in midair and crashed into a muddy field about 0.9 miles short of the runway. The impact broke the plane into 3 large pieces. Thankfully, there was no fire. Out of 135 people on board, 9 sadly lost their lives, including all 3 pilots. The rest had various injuries, but many survived thanks to the way the crash happened at low speed and without fire. Investigators later found that the faulty radio altimeter was the main cause of the crash, but they also said the pilots could have saved the flight if they had noticed the speed dropping sooner. It wasn't the last time a cockpit crew missed a silent killer in the sky, but what if no one on board even had the chance to react? Because they were already unconscious? Helios Airways Flight 522. Helios Airways Flight 522 was a routine flight scheduled to go from Larnaca, Cyprus to Prague, Czech Republic, with a planned stop in Athens, Greece. On August 14, 2005, the plane, a Boeing 737-300, took off from Larnaca with 121 people on board, including 115 passengers and 6 crew members. Most of the passengers were families heading off on summer vacation. Shortly after takeoff, the flight climbed like normal, but behind the scenes, something critical was wrong. The cabin pressurization system, which makes sure there's enough oxygen in the cabin as the plane climbs to high altitudes, was set to manual instead of auto. This setting had been used earlier during a maintenance check, but no one switched it back. As the plane climbed to around 34,000 feet, the cabin failed to pressurize. That meant the air inside the plane was getting thinner and thinner. Without realizing it, everyone on board began suffering from hypoxia, a lack of oxygen. Within minutes, the crew and passengers lost consciousness. The autopilot kept the aircraft flying smoothly, but after entering Greek airspace and failing to respond to air traffic control, 2 fighter jets were scrambled to intercept it. When the fighter pilots got close, they saw a chilling scene. The captain and the first officer were slumped over, oxygen masks were hanging down, and no one was flying the plane. Amazingly, One flight attendant, Andreas Prodromu, had stayed conscious long enough to make it into the cockpit. He had a pilot's license and tried to take control, but the engines eventually failed due to running out of fuel. The plane went into a dive and crashed into a hillside near the town of Grammatico, roughly 25 miles north of Athens. It was traveling at around 300 miles per hour. All 121 people on board were killed instantly. Investigators later confirmed that the accident happened because the crew didn't switch the pressurization system back on to auto. No alarms were taken seriously. Communication between the pilots and maintenance staff was confusing, and the flight crew wasn't properly trained to catch the problem in time. One man tried to save the flight, but he was too late. Coming up next, a day when the world witnessed the deadliest aviation tragedy ever recorded, and it all started with confusion on the ground. Tenerife Airport Disaster. The Tenerife Airport disaster is the deadliest accident in aviation history. It happened on March 27, 1977, and involved two huge Boeing 747 planes. One was KLM Flight 4805, flying from Amsterdam, and the other was Pan Am Flight 1736, coming from Los Angeles with a stop in New York. Both planes were headed to Gran Canaria Airport, a popular destination in the Canary Islands. But because of a terrorist bombing at Gran Canaria that day, they were diverted to a much smaller airport in Los Rodeos Airport on Tenerife Island. That airport wasn't built to handle so much traffic, and it only had one main runway and no ground radar to help control the planes. The crash happened because of a terrible chain of miscommunications and thick fog that dropped visibility to less than 1,000 feet. The KLM plane was getting ready to take off. It taxied onto the runway, turned around, and lined up for departure. Meanwhile, the Pan Am plane was taxiing down the same runway, looking for the exit to get off. But because of the heavy fog, the Pan Am crew missed their exit. Now, both planes were on the same runway, but they couldn't see each other. Here's where it went tragically wrong. The KLM captain thought he had permission to take off, even though he hadn't been officially cleared by the control tower. Due to overlapping radio calls and confusing wording, he believed it was safe to go. Despite his flight engineer raising concerns, the KLM captain pushed the throttles forward and started speeding down the runway. By the time the two crews saw each other, it was way too late. The KLM plane tried to lift off early, but its underside ripped into the Pan Am plane at nearly 160 miles per hour. Both aircraft exploded into flames. In total, 583 people lost their lives that day. Investigators later found that the main cause of the crash was the KLM captain's decision to take off without clear permission. Aeroflot Flight 821. Aeroflot Flight 821 was a domestic flight from Moscow to Perm, a city sitting along the western edge of the Ural Mountains. Operated by Aeroflot Nord, a regional branch of Aeroflot, it was a late-night trip meant to carry business travelers and ordinary passengers heading home or connecting to other places. The aircraft was a Boeing 737-500, a reliable twin-engine jet, and it had 82 passengers and 6 crew members on board. The flight started off normally, but things went wrong as soon as they got closer to Perm. The weather was bad, with low clouds, rain, and very poor visibility, with the clouds sitting just a few hundred feet above the ground. As they prepared to land, the pilots turned off the autopilot and the automatic throttle control to fly manually. But right after that, they lost their sense of direction. Instead of descending, the plane actually began to climb without the pilots realizing it. Then, the aircraft rolled sharply to the left, flipped upside down, and went into a steep dive. The Boeing 737 plunged at high speed, crashing into a ravine near the city and tearing up a section of the Trans-Siberian Railway. The impact was devastating. Everyone on board, all 88 people, died instantly. Investigators looked closely into what went wrong. They found that one big issue was that the pilots got disoriented because they weren't used to Western-style flight instruments. They had trained on old Soviet planes, and the layout was different enough to cause deadly confusion in stressful conditions. Making matters worse, the captain had alcohol in his system, which impaired his decision-making. Both pilots were also severely fatigued, having not enough rest before the flight. On top of that, the plane had a known mechanical issue. The pilots had to manually control the throttles for each engine separately, which made the cockpit workload even harder during an already difficult landing. Avianca Flight 011. Avianca Flight 011 was a Boeing 747 that could carry both passengers and cargo. It was 6 years old and leased from SAS, nicknamed Olafo. On November 27, 1983, the flight was on its way from Paris to Bogota, Colombia, with planned stops in Madrid and Caracas. There was a delay in Paris because they had to wait for connecting passengers from Frankfurt who were flown in by Lufthansa after Avianca canceled an earlier flight. Around midnight, as the plane was getting ready to land in Madrid using runway 33, something went wrong. During the final approach, the aircraft started descending too early and didn't follow the correct landing procedure. With the landing gear and flaps already out, it crashed into 3 small hills near Mejorada del Campo, about 7.5 miles from the airport. The plane broke apart and caught fire, scattering wreckage across a wide area. Out of the 192 people on board, 181 died, including most of the passengers, the entire working crew, and some off-duty crew members. Only 11 passengers survived, and they were seriously injured. The Spanish authorities investigated the crash and recovered both the flight data and voice recorders. They found several issues that led to the accident. The crew entered the wrong navigation frequencies, got confused about their actual position, and descended below the safe altitude too soon. They also ignored a warning from the ground proximity warning system. The crew didn't properly double-check each other's work, and air traffic control was also blamed for poor coordination and cutting off radar tracking too early. This was a controlled flight into terrain accident, meaning the plane was working fine, but it hit the ground due to human error. It remains the deadliest plane crash in Spain involving a single aircraft. Air Algerie Flight 702P. On December 21, 1994, Air Algerie Flight 702P, the Boeing 737-200 named Oasis, was flying from Amsterdam to Coventry Airport in England. Its job was to pick up a shipment of live veal calves and then fly them to the Netherlands and France. The crew on board included 3 Algerian pilots and 2 British animal handlers. At the time, live animal exports were a big business, though not without controversy. The flight left Amsterdam without any problems, but as they approached Coventry early in the morning, conditions got tricky. A thick layer of fog covered the airport. Visibility was extremely poor, less than 2,300 feet, way below the minimum needed for a safe landing. To make things worse, the plane's navigation equipment was old. It wasn't able to lock onto the airport's instrument landing systems like modern planes do. Instead, the pilots had to rely on an older method called a surveillance radar approach. This meant air traffic controllers had to guide them down manually over the radio, a much harder and riskier way to land. During the final approach, the crew made a critical mistake. They kept descending even though they hadn't made visual contact with the runway, something pilots are never supposed to do. At just about 1 mile from the runway, the plane slammed into an 86-foot-tall electrical tower. The collision tore into the left wing and engine. The plane rolled out of control, flipped upside down, and crashed into a wooded area near Willenhall just outside Coventry. All 5 people on board were killed instantly. The investigation, led by the UK's Air Accidents Investigation Branch, found several problems. The biggest one was that the pilots went way below the minimum descent altitude without seeing the runway. They also didn't properly check their altitude instruments, and the first officer failed to call out important warnings. Fatigue was another major factor. The crew had been on duty for over 10 hours during the night, making mistakes more likely. El Al Flight 1862. El Al Flight 1862 was a cargo flight operated by a Boeing 747 freighter registered 4X-AXG. The plane was built in 1979 and had flown over 45,000 hours. On October 4, 1992, it took off from New York's JFK Airport, heading to Tel Aviv with a planned stop in Amsterdam for a crew change and cargo handling. It was carrying general cargo like fruit, electronics, and perfume, along with 1 extra passenger who wasn't part of the crew. Just 7 minutes after taking off from Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport, while climbing at about 6,400 feet, the number 3 engine on the right wing broke off. This happened because of a metal fatigue issue with parts called fuse pins. As the engine detached, it hit and knocked off the number 4 engine too. This caused serious damage to the wing and also took out important hydraulic systems needed to control the flaps. At first, the pilots managed to keep the plane flying, but as they started slowing down to get ready to land, the damage caused uneven lift. This made the pilot roll sharply to the right and they lost control. The aircraft crashed into 2 11-story apartment buildings in a neighborhood in Amsterdam called Belmermeer. It exploded on impact and caused part of the buildings to collapse. Tragically, all 4 people on the plane and 43 people on the ground were killed. Another 26 people were injured. An investigation by the Dutch Aviation Safety Board found that the crash happened because the fuse pins, which held the engines in place, had worn out and failed. After the crash, Boeing updated its safety rules for these parts on all 747s. Kegworth Air Disaster. British Midland Flight 092 was a new Boeing 737-400 flying from London to Belfast on January 8, 1989, with 126 people on board. About 13 minutes into the flight, While climbing, a fan blade in the left engine broke. It caused strong vibrations, smoke, and loud noises. The pilots thought the problem was in the right engine and shut that one down by mistake. This confusion happened because the newer 737 had a different ventilation setup than older models, which made the signs misleading. They decided to land at East Midlands Airport, flying on just the damaged left engine. But during the final approach, that engine failed too and caught fire. The plane lost control and crashed just short of the runway, breaking into 3 pieces. 47 people died and 74 were seriously hurt. No one on the ground was injured. After the crash, investigators from the Air Accidents Investigation Branch found that the fan blade had broken due to something called aerodynamic flutter, a problem made worse because Boeing hadn't done enough testing during flight before releasing this model, but the main issue was human error.